Montana Territory, 1872. Ash and soot swirled through the air like vengeful spirits as Luke Hawkins watched everything he had built over the last 5 years vanish into the hungry flames. His cabin, barn, livestock, and even the small box containing his mother's locket. All of it consumed by a merciless fire that had swept through the valley during the summer drought. At 25, Luke stood tall and lean, hardened by years of ranch work, but now his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of total loss. "Nothing worth saving out here," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair as dawn broke over the blackened remains of his homestead. His angular face, normally handsome despite the light stubble from days of fighting the fire, had taken on a hollow expression that aged him beyond his years. The frontier had taught Luke a brutal lesson. Attachment meant inevitable loss. First his parents to typhoid when he was 15, then his uncle who had taught him ranching, and now every possession he had accumulated through backbreaking work. The Montana Territory took more than it gave, and Luke had finally learned that the only way to survive was to expect nothing, need nothing, and depend on no one. "A man stands alone out here," he told his horse, the only survivor of the blaze. "That is the only certainty in this godforsaken territory." For the next 2 weeks, Luke camped in the remains of his barn, sleeping on a singed blanket beneath the stars visible through the burned-out roof. The neighboring ranch had offered him shelter, but pride kept him on his land. He spent his days salvaging what little remained and rebuilding a small lean-to for temporary shelter. His hands blistered and bled as he worked himself to exhaustion, falling into dreamless sleep each night before starting again at dawn. On the 15th day after the fire, Luke rode into Timber Creek, the closest semblance of civilization within a day's ride. The small mining town had sprung up 3 years earlier when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. It consisted of a general store, saloon, a small hotel, livery stable, and a handful of clapboard buildings attempting respectability on the main street. "Mr. Reynolds," Luke called as he entered the general store, his voice rougher from disuse. "I need supplies. Basic provisions to get through the month." He laid his few remaining dollars on the counter, knowing it wasn't enough. George Reynolds, the storekeeper, looked at Luke with poorly disguised pity. "Luke, boy, this won't buy half what you need. It's all I have until I can." The bell above the door jingled, interrupting their conversation. Luke turned, instinctively stepping back to make room for whoever had entered. The sight stole whatever words he'd been about to say. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted momentarily by the bright September sunlight behind her. As she stepped fully into the store, Luke could see she was young, perhaps 20, with hair the color of sunlit honey falling in gentle waves past her shoulders. Her blue calico dress was simple but well-made, cinched at a narrow waist. When she looked up, her eyes were a clear, startling blue that reminded Luke of mountain lakes he'd seen high in the Rockies. "Miss Keller," Mr. Reynolds called, his entire demeanor brightening. "Welcome back. We didn't expect you for another week." "The stage made better time than expected," she replied with a smile that transformed her already beautiful face into something that made Luke's chest tighten unexpectedly. "And please, call me Faith. Miss Keller makes me feel like I should be wearing spectacles and scolding children." "Faith it is, then," the storekeeper agreed. "Your uncle mentioned you'd be arriving to help with the school." "Yes, though I understand I'll have to be quite resourceful." Her gaze shifted to Luke, taking in his soot-stained clothing and the weary lines around his eyes. Rather than showing the discomfort most proper Eastern women might display at his rough appearance, she simply nodded politely. "Luke Hawkins," Mr. Reynolds said, gesturing between them. "Faith Keller. Faith is Reverend Miller's niece from Pennsylvania, come to help establish a proper school." Luke nodded curtly, uncomfortable with the way she seemed to look right through him. "Miss Keller." "Mr. Hawkins," she replied, then turned back to Mr. Reynolds. "I have a list from my uncle of supplies he needs for the church." Luke stepped back, ready to leave, when Mr. Reynolds called him back. "Luke, wait. About those supplies." The storekeeper hesitated. "I could extend credit, given the circumstances, but—" "I don't take charity," Luke said flatly. Faith Keller turned, her brow furrowed slightly. "What circumstances?" "Lost his entire ranch to the fire 2 weeks back," Mr. Reynolds explained. "Nothing left but the land and his horse." Luke bristled at having his misfortune discussed as though he weren't standing right there. "I'll manage," he said tersely. To his surprise, Faith's expression showed not pity but thoughtful consideration. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand pride is a powerful force, but practicality must sometimes prevail." She turned to Mr. Reynolds. "Please add Mr. Hawkins' essential supplies to my uncle's account. We can discuss repayment terms that preserve dignity all around." "Now wait just a minute," Luke began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "My uncle is looking for someone to help repair the church roof and build benches for the schoolroom. It appears you have building skills and need supplies. This isn't charity, Mr. Hawkins. It's a fair exchange." Luke stared at her, caught between pride and necessity. There was something in her direct gaze that challenged his certainty that he needed to stand alone. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and Reverend Miller himself entered. "Faith, you've arrived." The older man embraced his niece, then noticed Luke. "Ah, Mr. Hawkins, I was hoping to find you. I heard about your misfortune and wanted to discuss a proposition with you." 3 days later, Luke found himself hammering new shingles onto the church roof, while Faith organized the small room that would serve as Timber Creek's first proper school. He had initially agreed to work for 1 week to cover the cost of his basic supplies, but the Reverend had offered him a fair wage to complete additional work, enough to begin rebuilding his life. From his perch on the roof, Luke could occasionally glimpse Faith through the church window as she arranged books and cleaned the space. Despite his determination to keep his distance, he found himself watching her more often than was necessary. There was a quiet determination about her that seemed out of place in this rough territory, yet she never complained about the primitive conditions or the dust that seemed to settle on everything. On the 4th day, as Luke was taking a break beneath the lone cottonwood tree beside the church, Faith appeared with a jar of water and a plate with bread and cheese. "You've been working since dawn," she said, offering the simple meal. "I thought you might be hungry." Luke hesitated before accepting. "Thank you." She settled on the grass nearby, arranging her skirts modestly around her. "May I ask what you plan to do after you've finished here?" "Start rebuilding my ranch," he answered automatically, "though it will take years to get back what I lost." Faith nodded. "My father lost everything in the war. Our home in Virginia, his business, eventually his health. He used to say that what matters isn't what you lose, but what you do after. No disrespect to your father, Miss Keller, but platitudes don't rebuild barns or replace livestock." Rather than taking offense, she laughed, the sound unexpectedly bright in the quiet churchyard. "Oh," he would have agreed completely. He was the least sentimental man I've ever known. When he said that, he meant it practically, that wallowing changes nothing, while action rebuilds. Luke studied her, realizing he had misjudged her. "How old are you, Miss Keller?" 22, she answered. "Old enough to know that the frontier doesn't care about feelings, only actions." "Then why come here? A woman with your education could have a comfortable life in the East." Something flickered across her face, a shadow of old pain. "Sometimes the wilderness offers more freedom than civilization, Mr. Hawkins. Out here, people judge you by what you can contribute, not by your past or family name." Before Luke could ask what she meant, Reverend Miller called her name from the church doorway, and their conversation ended. As Faith walked away, Luke found himself wondering what had brought this educated Eastern woman to the Montana Territory, and why her words about rebuilding after loss had resonated more deeply than any others he'd heard since the fire. Over the next 2 weeks, Luke finished the church repairs and began building the school benches. He found reasons to work later each day, often coinciding with the hours Faith spent preparing her classroom. Their conversations grew longer and less formal. He learned she had been a teacher in Philadelphia before coming west, that her mother had died when she was young, and that she could recite Shakespeare from memory, but also knew how to shoot a revolver with surprising accuracy. "My father believed women should be educated in all practical matters," she explained one evening as they sat on the church steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Including self-defense." "A progressive viewpoint," Luke commented. He saw too much during the war to believe in sheltering women from harsh realities. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Like you've seen too much to believe in permanence." Luke stiffened. "I don't recall sharing my philosophies with you, Miss Keller." "Faith," she corrected gently. "After 2 weeks of daily conversation, I think we can dispense with formalities. And you didn't have to tell me. It's written in everything you do. You work as though each day might be your last, saving every penny, planning every detail of your rebuild. But you never speak of the future beyond the immediate necessities. The future is a luxury I can't afford right now, he said, uncomfortable with her perception. Perhaps, Faith said, rising to her feet and brushing dust from her skirt. But I wonder if you couldn't afford it even before the fire. She left him sitting there, troubled by her words and the way they had pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. The school opening ceremony took place on a crisp October Sunday, with most of Timber Creek's residents in attendance. Luke stood at the back of the crowd, watching as Faith addressed the assembled parents and children with confident authority that belied her youth. She spoke passionately about opportunity and the importance of education on the frontier, and Luke could see the community responding to her vision. Afterward, as people mingled and examined the simple but sturdy classroom, Reverend Miller approached Luke. "You've done fine work here," the older man said, looking around at the benches and repaired roof. "I have more than enough funds to keep you employed through winter if you're interested. The parsonage needs renovating, and there's talk of building a proper doctor's office next spring. I appreciate the offer, Reverend, but I need to start rebuilding my own place before snow flies." "Of course," the Reverend nodded, "though I wonder if you've considered that rebuilding might go faster with help." He glanced meaningfully toward Faith, who was showing a group of children how to use a slate board. The community would rally behind one of their own. "I'm hardly one of the community," Luke said. "I've kept to myself since arriving 3 years ago. And yet you built these benches with enough care that they'll last a generation," the Reverend observed. "That speaks of a man who sees beyond his own immediate needs." Before Luke could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the gathering. 3 men on horseback had arrived, trail-worn and rough-looking. Luke recognized them immediately. The Tanner brothers, notorious troublemakers who periodically came to town to drink and cause problems. "Where's the new schoolmarm?" the eldest, Jeb Tanner, called out, his words slightly slurred despite the early hour. "Heard she's a right pretty little thing from back east." Luke moved forward instinctively, positioning himself between the newcomers and where Faith stood with the children. "This is a school celebration, Tanner. You and your brothers should move along." Jeb's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Well, if it ain't Luke Hawkins. Heard you lost everything in that fire. Must be working as the schoolmarm's guard dog now, eh?" Several men from town stepped forward, backing Luke up. Reverend Miller moved to defuse the situation. "Gentlemen, you're welcome to attend services next Sunday, but I must ask you to leave if you can't behave appropriately at a school function." For a tense moment, it seemed the Tanners might cause trouble, but then Faith walked forward, her posture straight and unafraid. "Mr. Tanner, I presume," she said calmly. "I'm Faith Keller, the teacher. If you or your brothers wish to improve your education, the school will welcome adult students on Tuesday and Thursday evenings beginning next week. Otherwise, as Reverend Miller said, this is a family gathering." Her composure and direct address seemed to confuse Jeb Tanner. He stared at her, then spat on the ground. "Ain't here for no schooling. Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about." He jerked his head at his brothers. "Come on. This ain't worth our time." As they rode away, Luke realized he had moved protectively close to Faith without conscious thought. She glanced up at him with a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, "though I suspect they're more bluster than threat." "Don't underestimate men like that," Luke warned. "The Tanners have caused serious trouble before." "I'll be careful," she promised, then added with a hint of mischief, "Remember, I can shoot." The incident with the Tanners faded into the background as October progressed. Luke divided his time between town work and beginning the long process of clearing and rebuilding on his land. Despite his initial reluctance, he found himself accepting help from several men in town who arrived one Saturday morning with tools and supplies. "Reverend organized us," explained Samuel Porter, the blacksmith. "Said it was a community effort. Most of us have been where you are at some point." By sundown, they had cleared the burned remains and laid the foundation for a new cabin. Luke, overwhelmed by the generosity, invited the men to share the stew he had prepared over an open fire. "We'll be back next Saturday," Samuel said as they departed. "Should have the walls up before the first heavy snow." Luke sat alone by the fire that night, staring at the stars and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. For the first time since the fire, perhaps for the first time since arriving in the territory, he felt connected to something larger than himself. The following day, he attended church services, sitting in the back row and watching Faith lead the children's portion of the service. Afterward, he found himself lingering, waiting until she finished speaking with parents about the upcoming school week. "Mr. Hawkins," she greeted him, her eyes brightening. "I didn't expect to see you today." "Luke," he corrected, echoing her words from weeks before. "I believe we've moved past formalities." Her smile widened. "Luke, then, how is the rebuilding coming along?" "Better than expected. Some men from town helped yesterday." He hesitated, then asked, Would you like to see it? The progress, I mean. If you're not too busy this afternoon." Faith looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. "I'd like that very much." They rode out to his land that afternoon, Faith sitting side saddle on a horse borrowed from her uncle. Luke found himself seeing his property through new eyes as he showed her the foundation of the cabin and explained his plans for rebuilding. "It's beautiful land," Faith said, looking out over the valley. "You can see why you chose it." "My uncle found it," Luke admitted. "He had a vision of what it could become. I just inherited his dream." "And made it your own," Faith added. She turned to face him fully. "That's not insignificant, Luke. Many men would have sold and moved on after losing a family member." Luke shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "It was the practical choice at the time." "Is that all it was?" She took a few steps away, bending to pick up a wildflower that had somehow survived both fire and frost. "I think perhaps you stayed because you needed roots. Something to belong to." "You seem very certain about my motivations for someone who's known me less than a month," Luke said, defensive yet intrigued by her perceptions. "I've spent my life observing people," Faith replied, twirling the flower between her fingers. "It was necessary in my previous life." "Your previous life? You speak as though you've lived several." Something shadowed her expression. "In a way, I have. The Faith Keller who exists in Philadelphia society bears little resemblance to the woman standing before you now." Luke sensed there was more to her story than she was sharing, but before he could ask, a distant sound caught his attention. Horses approaching fast. He squinted against the late afternoon sun, then felt his body tense. "Get behind me," he said quietly but firmly. "It's the Tanners, and they're riding hard." The three brothers pulled up their horses in a cloud of dust, Jeb's face twisted in an ugly grin. "Well, ain't this cozy?" The schoolmarm and the burned-out rancher, all alone in the wilderness. Luke positioned himself in front of Faith. "What do you want, Tanner?" "Just being neighborly," Jeb replied, dismounting. His younger brothers followed suit. "Thought we'd check on your rebuilding efforts. Maybe offer some help." "I have all the help I need," Luke replied evenly, though his heart was pounding. He had no weapon beyond a knife, and the Tanners were all armed. "Do you now?" Jeb sneered. "Seems to me you're barely scraping by. Word is, you've been taking charity." "The community is helping a neighbor," Faith spoke up from behind Luke. "Something you might understand if you weren't so determined to remain outsiders." Jeb's attention shifted to her, his expression darkening. "Fancy words from a fancy lady. You think you're better than us, don't you? Coming out here to civilize the wilderness." "I think," Faith said with remarkable composure, "that you're trying to provoke a confrontation to justify whatever you're really here for. If it's money, we have none. If it's intimidation, you're wasting your time." The middle brother, Clyde, laughed harshly. "She's got you figured, Jeb." Jeb shot his brother an angry look. "Shut up." He turned back to Luke. "We heard there's a payroll coming through for the mine workers next week. Stage will stop in town. Might be worth a man's while to be around when it does." Luke understood immediately. "If you're planning what I think you are, reconsider. The mining company will send armed guards." "Maybe," Jeb shrugged. "Or maybe we just need someone who knows the town. Someone who could tell us when the stage arrives, where the money's kept overnight." He looked pointedly at Luke. "Someone who needs money to rebuild." Luke felt cold fury building inside him. "You're asking me to help you rob the payroll." "I'm offering you a business opportunity," Jeb corrected. 1/4 share. Enough to rebuild your ranch proper, not the shack you're planning." "The answer is no," Luke said flatly. "Now get off my land." Jeb's face hardened. "Think about it, Hawkins. You've got until Friday to decide." His gaze shifted to Faith. "Be a shame if something happened to the schoolhouse. Fire hazards everywhere these days." The threat hung in the air as the Tanners mounted up and rode away. Luke waited until they were out of sight before turning to Faith, who was pale but composed. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, but those men are more dangerous than I realized. We need to get back to town and warn your uncle and the sheriff," Luke said, already leading her to the horses. "The Tanners have made threats before, but never this direct." As they rode back to town, Luke felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The Tanners had threatened not just him but Faith and the school she had worked so hard to establish. For the first time since the fire, something mattered more than his own survival and rebuilding efforts. He found himself glancing at Faith, riding straight back beside him, and realized with startling clarity that he couldn't bear the thought of any harm coming to her. The sheriff took their report seriously, promising to organize extra watches around the school and church. Reverend Miller insisted Faith stay in the parsonage rather than the small room behind the schoolhouse until the threat passed. "You should stay in town too," Faith told Luke as they stood on the church steps that evening. "It's not safe for you out there alone." "I'll be fine," he assured her. "The Tanners won't waste time on me until they know my answer about their business proposition." Faith placed her hand on his arm, her touch light but compelling. "Luke, promise me you won't do anything reckless. These men are capable of real violence." "I promise," he said, covering her hand with his own. The simple contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the evening air. "But I won't let them threaten you or this town." The days that followed were tense. Luke helped organize men to take shifts watching the school and church, while continuing to work on rebuilding his cabin with the help of townspeople. Faith refused to close the school, insisting that giving in to intimidation would only encourage further threats. On Thursday evening, Luke was finishing work on the parsonage roof when Faith called up to him. "I've made dinner," she said. "Uncle had to visit a sick parishioner, so it's just us if you'd care to join me." Over a simple meal of stew and biscuits, they talked of ordinary things, books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they once had. As darkness fell and they moved to sit by the fire, Luke found himself studying Faith's profile in the flickering light. "Why did you really come to Montana Territory?" he asked softly. "You never fully answered when I asked before." Faith was quiet for so long that Luke thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was engaged in Philadelphia, to the son of my father's business partner. It was arranged when I was 17, more a merger than a marriage." She stared into the fire. He was handsome, wealthy, and utterly cruel beneath his polished manners. "I discovered too late that he had already ruined one young woman and abandoned her when she became pregnant." Luke felt an unexpected surge of anger toward this unknown man. "What happened?" "I broke the engagement publicly, told everyone what he had done." Her voice strengthened. "His family was powerful. They destroyed what remained of my father's business and my reputation. My father died shortly after, some say from the shame and stress. The scandal was such that no respectable school would hire me, despite my education." "So you came west," Luke said, understanding dawning. Faith nodded. "My uncle had written for years about the need for teachers here. I had nothing left in Philadelphia except painful memories and whispered accusations." She looked up at him. "The fire that destroyed your ranch consumed everything you owned, Luke. But the fire I fled consumed everything I was." Without thinking, Luke reached for her hand. "You rebuilt yourself, as you are rebuilding your ranch." Her fingers tightened around his. "Perhaps that's why I felt drawn to you from the first. I recognized a fellow survivor." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Luke found himself leaning toward her, drawn by something more powerful than the caution that had governed his life for years. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Luke rose quickly, hand moving instinctively to his belt where his knife was sheathed. Faith stood as well, straightening her skirts. "It's probably just Uncle returning," she said, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. Luke opened the door to find not Reverend Miller, but Samuel Porter, the blacksmith. "Luke," Samuel said urgently. The Tanners were spotted riding into town. Sheriffs gathering men at the saloon. "I'll come right away," Luke replied, reaching for his coat. He turned to Faith. "Stay here with the door locked. Don't open it for anyone except your uncle or me." "Be careful," she said, her eyes filled with concern. At the saloon, Luke found the sheriff organizing the town's men into groups. "The stage with the payroll is arriving tomorrow," Sheriff Davis explained. According to our information, the Tanners plan to hit it just outside town. We need to set a trap, one of the miners suggested. Let them think they're going to succeed, then catch them in the act. After much discussion, a plan was formed. Luke found himself assigned to help guard the schoolhouse and church, as the Tanners had specifically threatened those buildings as a distraction. As he walked back to the parsonage to check on Faith, Luke felt a growing certainty that the confrontation with the Tanners would come to a head soon, and that whatever happened would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Reverend Miller had returned by the time Luke reached the parsonage. The older man listened gravely to the news about the Tanners and the planned defense. I should help guard the church, the Reverend said. No, Luke replied firmly. Your place is here with Faith. I've promised to watch over the church and school. Faith, who had remained silent during their conversation, suddenly spoke up. I should be at the school. If there's a fire, I need to save the books and supplies. We can't replace them. Absolutely not, both men said in unison. Faith, please, Luke added more gently. The Tanners are dangerous. Stay here where it's safe. Though she clearly disagreed, Faith nodded reluctantly. Promise me you'll be careful, she said to Luke. Don't try to be a hero. I promise, he replied, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Dawn broke misty and cold the next morning. Luke had spent the night keeping watch at the church, relieving another man at midnight. As the sun began to rise, painting the mountains gold and pink, an uneasy feeling settled over him. Something didn't feel right about the Tanners' plan. If they wanted to rob the stage, why threaten the school? Why involve Luke at all? The sound of approaching hoofbeats caught his attention. Luke moved into the shadow of the church, hand on his revolver. A lone rider appeared through the mist, Samuel Porter. Luke, Samuel called out, dismounting quickly. The Tanners were seen heading toward your property. My land. Luke felt confused. There's nothing there but a half-built cabin. The sheriff thinks they're setting up an ambush. They figure you'll have told us about the payroll plan, so they're changing tactics. Luke's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. They're not after the payroll. They never were. They wanted to draw attention away from their real target. Which is what? Samuel asked. Me, Luke said grimly. And Faith. They want revenge for being publicly challenged. He started toward his horse. I need to get out there. If they don't find me, they might come back to town looking for Faith. I'll gather men and follow. Samuel called as Luke mounted. Wait for us. But Luke was already galloping out of town, fear driving him faster than caution. The Tanners had created an elaborate distraction, knowing the town would focus on protecting the payroll. Their real plan, whatever it was, had to do with him and Faith. Perhaps they meant to burn his new cabin as a warning, or worse, use it to lure him or Faith into a trap. As he approached his property, Luke slowed his horse and proceeded more cautiously. The morning mist still hung in the valley, obscuring clear sight beyond a few hundred yards. He dismounted and continued on foot, moving silently through the trees that bordered his land. The half-built cabin came into view, looking eerily abandoned in the misty morning light. Nothing appeared disturbed. Luke scanned the surrounding area, seeing no sign of the Tanners or their horses. Had Samuel been mistaken? Or had the Tanners already come and gone, perhaps leaving some kind of trap? A small movement near the cabin caught his eye. Luke froze, peering through the mist. His heart stopped as a familiar figure emerged from behind the unfinished structure. Faith. She was alone, looking around anxiously, her blue dress vivid against the gray morning. What was she doing here? How had she gotten ahead of him? Luke stepped out of the trees, about to call her name, when instinct made him pause. Something was wrong. Faith looked too calm, too purposeful. This wasn't a woman who had rushed out in fear or confusion. Before he could process this, a man's voice called out, "Did you find anything?" Jeb Tanner emerged from the other side of the cabin, rifle in hand. Luke tensed, ready to rush forward to protect Faith, when she responded in a way that froze him in place. "Nothing useful," she called back to Jeb. "He hasn't started rebuilding the storage cellar yet." Luke felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Faith was working with the Tanners? It made no sense. "He'll be here soon," Faith continued, checking the small watch pinned to her dress. "Samuel should have delivered the message by now." "You're sure he'll come alone?" Jeb asked. "He'll think I'm in danger," Faith replied, and Luke detected a note in her voice he'd never heard before. Cool, calculated. Luke Hawkins is nothing if not predictable in his gallantry. Luke's mind reeled. The Faith he knew, compassionate, brave, principled, couldn't be the same woman coolly discussing what was clearly a trap. Yet there she stood, speaking familiarly with Jeb Tanner. Once we have the deed to his land, we can proceed with the rest of the plan, Faith was saying. The property controls the only reliable water source for miles. The mining company will pay handsomely for access rights. And no one will question when he disappears after losing everything in the fire, Jeb added with a cruel laugh. Just another broken man who couldn't face starting over. Luke's shock gave way to a cold, terrible clarity. This had been the plan all along. Not robbery, not simple intimidation, but a calculated scheme to gain control of his land that was apparently far more valuable than he had realized. And Faith, or whoever she really was, had played him perfectly. Her story about Philadelphia, her interest in his rebuilding efforts, even her apparent concern for the town, all lies designed to gain his trust. The realization cut deeper than any physical wound. Luke had begun to open himself to the possibility of a future that included more than mere survival. He had let himself care for her, had begun to hope for something he had convinced himself was impossible on the frontier, a partner, a home, love. Now that fragile hope lay shattered at his feet, replaced by a sense of betrayal so profound it threatened to drive him to his knees. Luke forced himself to focus. He needed to get away, to warn the town. If Faith and the Tanners were willing to murder for land, what else might they do? The school, the children, the community that had rallied to help him, all could be at risk. He began to back away slowly, planning to circle around to his horse. But as he moved, a twig snapped beneath his boot. The sound, slight as it was, carried in the still morning air. Faith's head snapped up, her gaze scanning the trees where Luke stood partially concealed. "Someone's there," she said sharply. "Jeb, check the woods." Luke turned to run, but Clyde Tanner stepped out from behind a tree, rifle aimed at Luke's chest. "Going somewhere, Hawkins." Forced into the open at gunpoint, Luke found himself face to face with Faith. Up close, he could see subtle differences he hadn't noticed before, a hardness in her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of calculation rather than compassion. "I must say, you arrived earlier than expected," she remarked, studying him with detached interest. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Luke replied, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Who are you really?" "Because you're not Faith Keller." She smiled, the expression nothing like the warm smiles he had come to treasure. "Actually, I am Faith Keller. Everything I told you about Philadelphia was true. I simply omitted certain details, like how I met the Tanners while traveling west, and how we recognized a mutual opportunity." "The fire," Luke said, the pieces falling into place. "You started the fire that destroyed my ranch." "A necessary first step," Faith acknowledged without a hint of remorse. "You were too established, too self-sufficient. We needed you vulnerable, dependent on community goodwill. The fire accomplished that perfectly." "Why?" Luke demanded. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? You could have simply made an offer for the land." "You wouldn't have sold," Jeb interjected. "That land's been in your family too long. But a man who's lost everything, facing a harsh winter with nothing but the clothes on his back, that man might be persuaded to sign over a deed for enough money to start fresh elsewhere." "Except I didn't leave," Luke said, understanding dawning. "I stayed and started rebuilding." "An unexpected complication," Faith agreed. "You were supposed to give up, not find renewed purpose. Hence our current, more direct approach." Luke looked at her, searching for any sign of the woman he thought he had come to know. Was any of it real? Any moment of connection between us? Something flickered in Faith's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "This is business, Mr. Hawkins. Nothing personal." "Enough talk," Jeb growled, stepping forward. "Sign the deed transfer, Hawkins, and we might let you ride out of here alive." Luke assessed his situation with grim clarity. 3 armed men and Faith against him alone. Samuel and the others might be on their way, but they could arrive too late. His options were few and none of them good. "The papers are in my saddlebag," Luke said finally. "Let me get them." "Clyde, go with him," Jeb ordered. "And Hawkins, don't try anything stupid." As Luke moved toward his horse, mind racing for any possible way out, a shot rang out from the direction of the road. Everyone froze. Then Jeb cursed. "Ryder coming in fast. It's that preacher." Luke turned to see Reverend Miller galloping toward them, followed by Samuel and several other men from town. In the moment of distraction, Luke lunged at Clyde, wresting the rifle from his hands. Faith screamed a warning, but too late. Luke had the weapon and dove for cover behind a stack of lumber. What followed was chaos. Shots were exchanged, men shouted, horses reared in panic. Through it all, Luke kept his eyes on Faith, who had taken cover behind the cabin wall. Their gazes met once across the clearing, hers wide with something that might have been fear or regret, his hard with betrayal and determination. When it ended, Jeb Tanner lay dead, shot by the sheriff who had arrived with the reinforcements. Clyde was wounded, and the youngest Tanner brother had surrendered, but Faith was nowhere to be seen. She ran into the woods when the shooting started, Samuel told Luke as the wounded were tended to. Sheriff's men are searching, but she had a head start. Reverend Miller approached Luke, his expression sorrowful. "I had no idea," the older man said. "She arrived with proper letters of introduction. The real Faith Keller is indeed my niece, but I had never met her in person before. This woman must have intercepted my correspondence somehow. So we don't even know her real name," Luke said hollowly. "The Tanners called her Florence." One of the captive Tanner brothers volunteered sullenly. "Florence Mitchell. Met her in Denver. Said she was looking for a fresh start after some trouble back east. Had this whole plan figured out about the water rights and the mining company." Luke nodded, feeling numb. Florence, not Faith. Another lie in a tapestry of deception. The weeks that followed passed in a blur for Luke. The imposter who had called herself Faith Keller was never found, despite a territory-wide search. The surviving Tanners went to prison for attempted murder and arson. Luke's land remained his, though he now understood its true value. The creek that ran through it was the only year-round water source accessible to the new mining operations. With winter approaching, the town rallied once more to help Luke rebuild his cabin. This time, he accepted their help without reservation, recognizing that his survival depended on being part of something larger than himself. The betrayal he had experienced left a deep wound, but it hadn't destroyed him, just as the fire had taken his possessions but not his resilience. By December, Luke had a solid cabin, a small barn, and provisions for winter. The school continued under the guidance of a new teacher, the real Faith Keller, who had finally arrived from Philadelphia after learning of the imposter. She was older than Florence, less striking in appearance, but genuine in her dedication to education. Luke kept his distance from her and everyone else, polite but reserved. The ability to trust, to hope for connections beyond mere survival, had been severely damaged by Florence's betrayal. He worked his land alone, rebuilt his herds slowly, and tried to convince himself that solitude was safer than vulnerability. As winter deepened, however, Luke found himself increasingly restless. The cabin he had built with such care felt empty despite its solid walls and warm hearth. The land that had been worth killing for seemed hollow, without someone to share in its prosperity. The future he envisioned stretched out before him, secure but solitary, and for the first time, that prospect filled him with a profound sadness rather than reassurance. On Christmas Eve, following tradition, the entire town gathered at the church for services and celebration. Luke attended out of respect for the community that had helped him rebuild, but planned to leave early, before the socializing began in earnest. As he slipped out during the final hymn, a voice called his name. He turned to find a young woman hurrying down the church steps after him. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it was Florence, but the figure resolved into someone unfamiliar, a woman perhaps 25 years old, with rich auburn hair and green eyes that regarded him with surprising directness. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, slightly breathless from her rush to catch him. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I've been hoping to speak with you." Luke tensed, wariness now his natural response to unexpected interactions. "Do I know you, ma'am?" "No," she replied with a small smile. "I'm Fiona Kelly. I arrived last week to take over the mercantile from Mr. Reynolds. He's retiring to Denver to live with his daughter." Luke vaguely recalled hearing about the change in ownership. "What can I do for you, Miss Kelly?" "Actually, it's what I might be able to do for you." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "This arrived for you, care of the store. It's from Denver." Luke accepted the letter cautiously. "Thank you for bringing it." "You're welcome." She hesitated, then added, I know about what happened. The whole town does. It was a terrible betrayal. Luke stiffened. I'm not interested in discussing it. Of course not, Fiona agreed quickly. I only meant, well, I've experienced betrayal too. My fiancé in Boston. He wasn't who he pretended to be either. Despite himself, Luke found his attention caught. Is that why you came west? Partly, she acknowledged. But mostly because I wanted to build something of my own, something real. She gestured toward the mercantile, a place where honest transactions happen, where trust is built through actions, not words. There was something in her straightforward manner that reminded Luke of the community that had helped him rebuild. Honest, unpretentious, genuine in both hardship and kindness. Nothing like Florence's calculated charm. I should let you get back to your celebration, Luke said, suddenly unsure. Actually, I was leaving too, Fiona admitted. Large gatherings still make me uncomfortable. I prefer quieter company. She glanced up at the star-filled sky. It's a beautiful night for a walk, though. The invitation was subtle but clear. Luke hesitated, the weight of recent betrayal heavy against the simple human longing for connection. I should read this, he said, indicating the letter. Of course, Fiona nodded, taking a step back. Merry Christmas, Mr. Hawkins. As she turned to leave, Luke found himself speaking. If you'd care to wait, it might only take a moment. Under the glow of the church lantern, Luke opened the letter. The handwriting was immediately familiar, sending a jolt through him. Florence. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier from Denver. Mr. Hawkins, it began formally. By the time you receive this, I will be far from Montana territory. I am writing not to ask forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but to offer the truth, which you do. My name is indeed Florence Mitchell. I was engaged in Philadelphia, disgraced, and driven west as I told you. But the similarities to Faith Keller end there. I met the Tanners in Denver, where they recognized in me a useful tool for their land scheme. I agreed to help them because I was desperate and angry at a world that had taken everything from me. What I didn't expect was to find in Timber Creek a community of genuine kindness, or in you a man of such principle and resilience. The fire was set before I arrived. That was the Tanners' doing, not mine, though I used its aftermath to gain your trust, which makes me equally culpable. What began as calculation became something I never anticipated, genuine respect, and, eventually, affection. The night before the confrontation at your land, when we sat by the fire and I told you about Philadelphia, every word was true. In that moment, I nearly abandoned the plan. But fear and the momentum of choices already made drove me forward to the disastrous end you witnessed. I am not asking for understanding or clemency. I write only so you know that not every moment between us was a lie. Some were the most honest of my life. The deed to your land remains rightfully yours. The water rights you control are indeed valuable, worth approximately $5,000 to the mining company. I include this information as small recompense for the damage I helped cause. Lastly, I wish to say what I should have said that morning. I am sorry, Luke Hawkins, for betraying the trust of a good man. The frontier may be harsh, but it was my own choices, not the wilderness, that revealed the true poverty of my character. With sincere regret, Florence Mitchell. Luke stared at the letter long after he finished reading, emotions warring within him. Anger, vindication, lingering pain, and beneath it all, a strange sense of closure. Florence had been both exactly and nothing like what he had believed. The connection he had felt with her had been both genuine and built on lies. Bad news? Fiona asked softly, still waiting a respectful distance away. No, Luke said, folding the letter carefully. Just clarification. Those can be the most difficult messages to receive, she observed. Luke studied her, this straightforward woman who had experienced her own betrayal, yet chosen to begin again. Who spoke of building trust through actions rather than words. Who preferred quiet company to loud celebration. Miss Kelly, he said, coming to a decision. Would you care to join me for a Christmas Eve meal? Nothing elaborate, just coffee and whatever I can put together at my cabin. Surprise registered on her face, followed by a warm smile that reached her eyes. I'd like that very much, Mr. Hawkins. But only if you'll call me Fiona. Luke, he offered in return. As they walked together through the starlit night, Luke felt something shift inside him. Florence's betrayal had taught him caution, But the community's response had shown him the value of connection. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving, but facing it alone was a choice, not a necessity. By spring, Luke's ranch was fully rebuilt, with improvements that made it more productive than before. The water rights negotiation with the mining company had provided capital for expansion, and his herd was growing steadily. But the most significant change was not in his property, but in his perspective. The young man who had stood alone watching fire consume everything had been replaced by someone who understood that true wealth lay in connections, to the land, to the community, and to the people one chose to trust despite the risks. On a warm May evening, as sunset painted the mountains gold and purple, Luke and Fiona sat on the porch of his completed house. Her hand rested comfortably in his, a gold band glinting on her finger, placed there just 2 weeks earlier in a ceremony attended by the entire town. "What are you thinking about?" Fiona asked, noting his contemplative expression. Luke smiled, gazing out over the land that had nearly cost him his life, but had ultimately led him to something more valuable than water rights or cattle. "I was thinking about fires," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "How they destroy, but also clear the way for new growth." "Poetic for a rancher," Fiona teased, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Perhaps," Luke agreed, "but true nonetheless. I lost everything in that fire last summer. Or so I thought." "And now?" she prompted. Luke turned to look at his wife, this woman who had walked into his life with honest eyes and a direct manner, who had rebuilt his ability to trust through consistent actions rather than elaborate promises. "Now I know that what matters can't burn," he said simply. "It can only grow stronger through the testing." As darkness settled over the Montana Valley, the lights from their cabin windows glowed warm against the gathering night, a beacon of the home they had built together on foundations stronger than timber and stone. Luke Hawkins, who had once believed the frontier left no room for anything beyond mere survival, had discovered that love could not only exist in harsh places but could transform them, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet heroism of daily trust, renewed each morning despite knowing the risks. In the end, he had indeed lost everything in the fire, but what he had found afterward, community, purpose, love, had made him richer than he had ever imagined possible.